I count in my sleep now. Numbers scroll behind my eyelids like requisition forms, neat columns that tally missions survived, limbs remaining, heartbeats until the next deployment, 17 missions, 14 fingers, 2 eyes, 0 illusions. The ringing in my ears never stops anymore, a high whine like a voxcaster left on in an empty room, but I've learned to parse meaning from the different pitches. The shrill note means incoming mortars, the deeper throb means my hands are shaking again. The flutter, almost musical, means I'm about to do something that will either kill me or add another number to my count. They gave me the red sash on Krastellan Prime 3 years ago by Imperial reckoning, though time moves differently when you're counting backward from your own execution. I'd been a clerk in the Administratum Archives on Vorstal, 4th-tier documentation specialist handling mineral tithes from the outer systems. Clean hands, clean record, clean uniform every morning, pressed sharp enough to cut lies from truth on the page. Then I found the discrepancy in the shipment manifests, saw where someone had been skimming Prometheum reserves, and I made the mistake that ended my old life. I reported it to the wrong superior, the one who'd been doing the skimming. 3 days later, they found contraband in my quarters. 1 week after that, I was on a prison transport heading rimward, stripped of name and rank and future, given a number instead. Penal Legion material, expendable, useful. The first thing they teach you in the Penal Legions is that redemption is measured in blood, preferably your own. The second thing is that some sins can only be cleansed by dying in the right way, at the right time, in service to the Emperor. The third thing they don't teach you at all because you learn it in your bones, in the trembling of your hands after the first mission, in the dreams that wake you screaming. Death is the easy way out, and they won't let you have it until you've earned it. I learned Demolitions because the Munitorum placement servitor scanned my work history and saw documentation specialist, and decided that someone who could read complex manifests could read blast radius calculations. They weren't wrong. I took to it like I'd taken to filing reports, finding comfort in the precision of it, the clean mathematics of destruction. Place charge here, set timer thus, withdrawal distance calculated to the meter. Even in the Penal Legions there is order, structure, systems that can be understood and obeyed. The ringing started after my second mission, when a heretic's countercharge detonated 30 meters closer than my calculations had predicted. The blast wave caught me mid-retreat, threw me through the air like the Emperor's own judgment made kinetic. I woke in the Medicae tent, with blood crusted in my ears, and a sound in my head like a Vox System's death scream, high and endless. The Medicae servitor informed me I had burst both eardrums, but would recover sufficient hearing for continued service. Sufficient, not full, not proper. Sufficient for a Penal Legionnaire, which is to say barely adequate for listening to orders before throwing yourself at the enemy's fortifications with 40 kilos of explosives strapped to your back. The servitor injected something cold into my arm and moved on to the next cot, where someone was trying to hold their intestines inside their abdominal cavity with both hands and failing. I lay there listening to the new permanent resident in my skull, that high-pitched whine, and understood that it would never leave me. A reminder, a companion, a countdown in audio form. I started counting after the third mission, not consciously at first, just tallying in my head as I sorted through the dead after we'd taken the Manufactorum on Gesic's world. 17 of us had gone in, 6 came back. Simple mathematics, the kind I'd done in the archives when comparing expected shipments against actual arrivals. Subtract the losses, file the report, move on to the next page. But in the Penal Legions, you are both the report and the reported loss, simultaneously recorded and erased. Your survival, a clerical error that the universe will correct given time and sufficient enemy fire. I counted the missions because it gave me something to control, a number that belonged to me in a life where I owned nothing, not even my name. They call me Wrecker 7 now, though I was Wrecker 12 when I started. The numbers above me have been subtracted from the ledger. The Colonel never looks at us directly. I noticed this on my 4th mission, during the pre-deployment briefing in the Command Chimera. He stands at the front of the compartment, tall and rigid in his Commissar black uniform with his Penal Legion command insignia gleaming silver against the fabric, and his eyes track across our faces like targeting servitors scanning for weak points. But they never quite focus on any individual soldier. He looks through us, past us, at some point on the far wall that only he can see. He speaks in a voice like gravel sliding down a mine shaft, deep and grinding, explaining our objective with the same emotional investment a tech priest shows when cataloging servitor maintenance schedules. Target coordinates. Breach point. Explosive yield required. Expected resistance. Estimated survival rate. That last number gets smaller with every briefing, but he recites it with the same flat inflection he uses for everything else, as if our deaths are just another variable in his calculations, neither tragic nor desired, but simply anticipated and planned for. I learned to read his silences better than his words, the way he pauses fractionally longer before announcing a particularly suicidal objective, the slight tightening at the corners of his mouth when he reviews the after-action casualty reports. He knows all our numbers, all our crimes, all our chances of survival, and he never forgets a single digit. Once, after a mission where I'd miscalculated the load-bearing capacity of a bridge and we'd lost Wrecker 3 in the collapse, he stood beside me as I stripped the remaining charges from my harness and said, "Your error margin is improving. Not absolution, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement." I hadn't known until that moment how desperately I needed someone to notice I was still trying to get better at my terrible work. The black box appeared after my 7th mission. I found it among the equipment in my kit when we were regrouping after a 3-day assault on a heretic stronghold in the underhive of Meridian's Fall. Small, maybe 20 centimeters square, matte black like a void ship's hull, with no visible seams or markings, except for a single red icon stamped on one side, the Administratum seal. My old life, compressed into a standardized warning symbol. I turned it over in my hands, feeling its weight, expecting it to contain orders or new equipment or some bureaucratic punishment for a violation I hadn't realized I'd committed. But it wouldn't open. No clasps, no maglocks, no access panels. Just a sealed cube of mystery sitting in my kit like a judgment I couldn't yet read. I asked Wrecker 4 about it, the only other legionnaire in our unit who'd survived long enough to become something resembling a friend, and he shook his head slowly, eyes tracking to the colonel's tent. "Don't ask," he said. "Don't look. Don't think about it. It's not for you." But it was in my kit, nested among my detonators and fuse wire and shaped charges, so how could it not be for me? The ringing in my ears had developed new qualities by then, new pitches and rhythms that mapped to different states of danger or awareness. The high whine still meant incoming fire, but I'd started hearing a lower pulse, almost subsonic, that preceded ambushes by about 10 seconds. Just enough time to drop into cover or trigger a defensive charge early. I didn't tell anyone about this development because it sounded like madness, like the kind of thing that gets you sent to a commissar for evaluation and then executed for suspected chaos taint. But it kept me alive through 3 engagements that should have ended my count. And after a while I stopped questioning it and started listening. Really listening. The ringing wasn't random noise, it was data. Information coded in frequency and amplitude. A language my damaged ears had learned to speak. Artillery fire sang high and urgent. Armor movement rumbled low and steady. Enemy infantry moved in clusters that created interference patterns I could feel in my back teeth. The Emperor protects, the preachers always said. But maybe he protects through strange means, turning damage into adaptation, weakness into survival. Wrecker 4 died on our 11th mission, caught in a crossfire while placing charges on a traitor guard ammunition depot. I watched him fall from my position 50 meters away, saw the last rounds punch through his chest in a diagonal line from shoulder to hip, watched him crumple like a report being filed away, no longer relevant to the current operation. The black box was in his kit too. I saw it when I retrieved his charge, harness and munitions, recognized the identical dimensions and that damning red seal. So it wasn't just mine. It was all of us. Every penal legionnaire in our unit carried one, buried among the tools of our explosive trade, sealed and silent, and impossible to ignore once you knew to look for them. I brought this observation to Wrecker 9, newly promoted to that number after the previous holder had been vaporized by a direct mortar hit, and she looked at me with eyes that had seen too much and said, "We're all carrying boxes we can't open." Wrecker 7. That's what it means to be here. That's what it means to be us. The Colonel's briefings became longer after that mission, more detailed in their technical specifications, more precise in their casualty projections. He'd started including information about blast wave propagation through different atmospheric densities, about the psychological impact of shaped charges versus conventional explosives, about the optimal ratio of dead to wounded when attacking enemy morale, information that seemed excessive for people who were just supposed to plant bombs and run away before they exploded. I listened with my damaged ears, hearing layers beneath his words, harmonic frequencies that suggested purpose beyond the obvious. He was teaching us something, not just how to destroy, but how to think about destruction in ways that went beyond the immediate tactical situation. One night, after a particularly long briefing, I approached him, something none of us ever did willingly, and asked why he gave us information we didn't need to follow orders. He looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time, and I saw something in his eyes that made the ringing in my ears surge to a painful crescendo. "Because," he said quietly, "some of you might survive long enough to need it. I survived my 15th mission by mistake. The charge I'd placed on the enemy command bunker detonated 12 seconds early due to faulty timing mechanisms in the Munitorum-issued equipment, catching our entire squad in the blast radius. I was the only one far enough back to avoid fatal injuries, though the concussive force shattered my left arm in 4 places and embedded shrapnel in my torso that the Medicae servitors decided wasn't worth extracting. Too close to vital organs, the servitor informed me, its voice flat with mechanical disinterest. Removal risks exceeding repair value. Subject remains combat capable with metal in situ. So, I carry pieces of that mission inside me now, small sharp reminders that shift when I breathe wrong, pressing against organs and nerves, a pain that never quite becomes unbearable, but never quite fades either. The black box opened after that mission. Not through any action of mine. I woke in the Medicae tent, and it was simply unsealed. Sitting on the small table beside my cot with its lid raised like a mouth preparing to speak. Inside, wrapped in preservation cloth, stamped with administratum seals, was a stack of papers. My papers. Not the falsified evidence they'd used to convict me of contraband possession, but the real documentation, the original tithes reports I'd filed, showing the Prometheum discrepancies in precise numerical detail. My handwriting, careful and exact, documenting theft from the Imperial war machine with all the bureaucratic thoroughness I'd been trained to employ. Proof of my innocence. Proof that I'd done my duty. Proof that my crime had been loyalty to the Emperor's law, and my punishment had been the reward for that loyalty. Beneath the reports lay a single sheet of orders, recent by the crisp quality of the paper, sealed with the Colonel's personal mark. Directive 771 Omega, continued observation of Subject 7 recommended. Demolitions aptitude exceeds baseline projections. Physiological adaptation to repeated blast trauma showing promising developments. Psychological profile remains stable despite extensive combat exposure. Subject demonstrates potential for specialist advancement upon completion of standard penal service term. Recommendation: maintain current deployment pattern. Monitor for catastrophic degradation. I read it 3 times. The Danes I Sephan, my broken arm throbbing in its synthcast, the shrapnel in my chest pressing against my ribs with each breath, the ringing in my ears cycling through frequencies that spoke of confusion and revelation in equal measure. They'd been watching, not punishing, watching, testing, measuring my survival against some internal metric I'd never been informed of. The colonel visited my Medicae cot that evening, standing at the foot of it with his hands clasped behind his back, still not quite looking at me directly. "Your crime was loyalty," he said without preamble, his voice pitched low enough that only I could hear. "Your punishment is transformation. The Imperium has no shortage of clerks, Wrecker 7, but it has an endless need for people who can approach death with calculation and precision, who can be broken repeatedly and still maintain the structure of their thinking. Penal legions are not just punishment details, they are refinement processes, blast furnaces that burn away everything weak or useless or extraneous, leaving only the alloy of what the Imperium actually needs." He paused, and something that might have been regret crossed his face, so quick I almost missed it. Most don't survive the refinement. Most aren't supposed to. But some do. Some emerge from the fire changed in ways that make them more valuable than they were before their crimes. Your ear damage isn't degradation, it's development. Your body is learning to read concussive waves, to sense danger through damaged tissue that's become more sensitive to pressure differentials than healthy ears ever could be. You're becoming a specialist in the truest sense. I wanted to rage at him, to throw the contents of the black box in his face, and demand to know what right the Imperium had to transform my life into an experimental program without consent or knowledge. But I was too tired, and the shrapnel in my chest hurt too much, and the ringing in my ears was showing me the truth of his words in the way it had already saved my life a dozen times over. I'd counted myself into survival, tallying missions and losses like a good clerk, not understanding that every number was a data point in someone else's larger calculation. "How many more?" I asked instead, my voice rough from the Medicae tubes they'd pulled from my throat that morning. "How many more missions until I've been refined enough?" The colonel almost smiled, a slight upward movement of one corner of his mouth that contained neither warmth nor cruelty, just acknowledgement. "There is no number," he said. "Refinement doesn't end, it just changes purpose. You'll know when you're ready for that change, because you'll stop counting backward from your death and start counting forward into your future." They deployed me again 2 weeks later, arm barely healed, shrapnel still embedded in my organs, ringing in my ears loud enough to feel like a third heartbeat. The target was a chaos cult stronghold deep in the acid swamps of Vexelum Terteus, a place where the air itself ate through protective gear and the ground sucked at your boots with the hunger of something semi-sentient. Our unit was down to 5 legionnaires. Me, Wrecker 9, 2 recent additions who hadn't earned names in my internal tally yet, and a replacement Wrecker 4 who looked young enough to have never held proper employment before whatever crime had landed him here. The colonel's briefing was brief, almost gentle in its bluntness. 30% survival rate on this operation, estimated. The cult had fortified an ancient temple complex with enough ordnance to level a hive spire, and our job was to infiltrate their perimeter and place charges that would collapse the entire structure into the swamp's acidic embrace. Standard suicide mission. Standard Penal Legion deployment. Except the colonel added something new at the end of his briefing, speaking directly to me for the first time in front of the others. "Wrecker 7, you have tactical command for this operation. Apply your judgment as you see fit." Judgment. A word I hadn't been permitted to apply to my own life in 3 years, suddenly handed back to me wrapped in 40 kilos of explosive and a map of a structure I'd never seen before. I studied the tactical display during our transport to the deployment zone, listening to the ringing in my ears layer over the data, adding frequencies that suggested approach vectors and danger zones and optimal charge placement with a precision that my pre-Penal Legion self would have called impossible. But I wasn't that clerk anymore. I was something the Imperium had needed badly enough to destroy who I'd been to create who I was becoming. The insertion went wrong immediately, because insertion always goes wrong when you're expendable by definition. Our transport took ground fire 2 kilometers from the drop zone and had to emergency deploy us into the swamp, leaving us waist deep in caustic water that ate through our boot soles within minutes. Wrecker 9 lost her left foot to acid erosion before we reached solid ground, the synth leather simply dissolving to expose bone and tendon that followed quickly after. I gave her the last of the neutralizing agent we carried and fashioned a tourniquet from detonation cord, sealing the stump before the acid could climb higher. She didn't scream. None of us scream anymore. Screaming is a waste of air. The approach to the temple took 6 hours of crawling through vegetation that leaked toxins from every surface, past mutated creatures that might have been local fauna or might have been failed cult experiments in demonic breeding. The ringing in my ears peaked and crashed in waves, warning me of patrol routes and sensor sweeps with increasing urgency. I routed us around 3 ambush positions and through a gap in their defensive perimeter that existed for exactly 14 minutes before they recalibrated their watch patterns. By the time we reached the temple's outer wall, we'd lost one of the new wreckers to something that came up from the swamp and pulled him under before any of us could react. His screams were muffled by the water, then by something worse than water, then by silence. 4 of us left. Worse odds than predicted. Better than I'd feared. The temple interior was a nightmare of corrupted architecture and half-melted Imperial iconography, the Chaos cult having built their stronghold inside the bones of what had once been a shrine to the Emperor. I could read the history of the place in the way the corruption had spread, like mold on old paper, eating away at the sacred and replacing it with something that made my eyes hurt to perceive directly. The ringing in my ears went haywire inside those walls, too many frequencies overlapping, too much sensory data packed into pressure waves and resonance patterns that my damaged hearing tried desperately to pass into useful information. I had to stop twice and vomit from the sensory overload, my balance systems failing, as the ringing became a roar, became a symphony of warnings about threats I couldn't properly identify. Wrecker 9 put her hand on my shoulder, steadying me, her face grey with pain from her acid-eaten stump, but her eyes still focused, still counting the same way I counted. "How many charges?" she asked. And I knew she wasn't asking about the mission. She was asking how many more counts we had left before our numbers came up for final subtraction. The placing of the charges took precision I'd never been required to demonstrate before. The temple's structure was ancient, its foundations sunk deep into bedrock that had withstood millennia of the swamp's assault, and simply blowing it apart would scatter debris over a wide enough area that the cult could potentially salvage materials and rebuild. The colonel wanted total collapse, complete subsumption into the acid swamp, erasure so thorough that future Imperial surveyors wouldn't even be able to confirm something had stood here. That meant finding the exact stress points, the precise locations where force applied in the correct vector would cause cascading failure throughout the entire structure. I worked by feel as much as calculation, letting the ringing in my ears guide my hands, trusting damage to show me what health couldn't perceive. Each charge placed with the same care I'd once used filing reports, each connection checked with the thoroughness of someone who understood that errors in documentation could lead to errors in reality. And in this reality, errors meant dying before the job was complete. We were discovered on the final charge placement, deep in the temple's foundation where the cultists had built their primary ritual chamber. Wrecker 4, the new one, the young one, triggered a pressure sensor I'd warned him about twice, and suddenly, the chamber was full of cultists, screaming their devotion to gods whose names blistered the air when spoken aloud. Las fire and stub rounds filled the space, carving through the corrupted pillars and ricocheting off stonework that had been altered by powers I refused to acknowledge. I detonated the nearest charge early, not to kill the cultists but to bring down a section of ceiling that created a barrier between us and their main force, buying us 30 seconds that we used to complete the final placements. Wrecker 4 died in those 30 seconds, a stub round through his throat, choking on blood and acid fumes, and promises he'd probably made to someone about coming home someday. I took his charges and placed them myself, doubling the yield at the central support column, ensuring that when this place fell, it would fall completely. The ringing in my ears hit a frequency I'd never heard before as we ran for the extraction point, something almost musical, almost beautiful. like the sound a tuning fork makes when struck perfectly in a void ship's silence. It wasn't warning me about danger. It was showing me completion, the moment when all calculations aligned, and the mathematics of destruction became something approaching elegance. The temple collapsed behind us in stages, each detonation triggering the next in a sequence I'd designed to maximize structural failure, and I felt it through my bones, through the shrapnel in my chest that resonated with the shock waves, through the ringing that had become part of my identity. The ground shook and the acid swamp rose up to claim what remained, dissolving stone and metal and corrupted flesh with the same patient hunger it had shown my boots. By the time we reached the extraction zone, there was nothing left but a boiling pit where the temple had stood, steam rising in columns that would be visible for kilometers around, a marker of absence. 3 of us survived to be pulled aboard the extraction Valkyrie. Me, Wrecker 9 on her acid-eaten stump, and the other new Wrecker whose number I'd never bothered to learn. The pilot reported 37 confirmed enemy casualties and complete destruction of the target structure. Mission success. Acceptable losses. The colonel was waiting when we landed back at the base camp, standing on the rockcrete pad with his hands behind his back, still not looking at me directly, but I could feel his attention like a weight, like gravity, like the crushing pressure of transformation reaching its final stage. He dismissed the other survivors and gestured for me to follow him to his command tent, where he sealed the entrance and finally, for the second time since I'd known him, looked me in the eyes. "You counted," he said. "It wasn't a question. You've always counted, from the first mission until now. Tallying your survival, measuring your degradation, cataloging your losses like a good clerk. But what were you really counting?" I didn't have to think about my answer because I'd been thinking about nothing else for 3 years. "I was counting backward from my execution," I said, and my voice was steady despite the ringing in my ears, reaching a crescendo that felt like my skull might crack from the pressure. Every mission was one number closer to 0, one step nearer to the death I'd been promised when they put me in red. I thought I was counting down to nothing. The colonel nodded slowly and pulled from his desk another black box, identical to the one that had opened in my Medicaid cot, but this one already unsealed, its lid raised to show contents I couldn't see from my angle. "You were counting wrong," he said, and his voice carried something that might have been satisfaction or might have been the closest thing to pride that a man who sends people to die for a living can feel. "You weren't counting down to your end. You were counting up to your beginning." Inside the box was a new uniform, not the red of the Penal Legions, but the black and silver of Imperial Demolitions, specialists, with rank insignia I'd never earned through conventional service. Beside it lay certification documents sealed with the Departamento Munitorum's official marks, proclaiming me qualified in advanced explosive ordnance disposal, structural demolition, and combat engineering. My sentence, according to the attached legal brief, had been commuted after 17 successful combat missions, my skills deemed too valuable to waste on continued penal service. I was being reassigned to a proper guard regiment, given actual rank and authority, and a future that extended beyond the next suicide deployment. I should have felt relief, or joy, or vindication at finally being recognized as something other than expendable, but all I felt was the ringing in my ears and the certainty that nothing had actually changed. I'd still be placing charges. I'd still be calculating blast radii and optimal yield and acceptable casualty rates. I'd still be destroying things with precision and care, the only difference being that now I'd do it with official sanction instead of as punishment. "You're not happy," the colonel observed, and there was understanding in his voice, the recognition of someone who'd walked this same path before me. "You thought redemption would feel different. You thought being released from the Penal Legions would return you to who you were before." I touched the shrapnel in my chest, felt it shift against my ribs, a permanent reminder of transformation's price. "I can't go back," I said quietly. "That clerk died when they loaded me on the prison transport. Everything after has been someone else, something else, built from the pieces that survived being broken repeatedly." The colonel pulled another document from his desk. This one older, yellowed at the edges, stamped with seals I recognized from my old life in the archives. My original personnel file from the administratum, complete and unaltered, showing my service record and commendations, and the final note about the contraband charges that had been falsified to remove me from their ranks. They needed to destroy you to create what you've become, he said, spreading the documents on his desk like evidence in a trial. The administratum identified you as someone with the right combination of precision, loyalty, and adaptability to survive conversion into a specialist they desperately needed. But they couldn't simply transfer you to demolitions training. You had to believe you were being punished. You had to count yourself toward death, because only in thinking you were dying could you transform into something capable of the work we needed done. He tapped the personnel file with one finger, and I saw his own name there in the investigating officer's signature, dated 3 years ago, the man who'd officially processed my conviction. I've been watching you since before you knew there was anything to watch. Since before you committed your crime by reporting those false manifests, I'd deliberately planted in your work queue to see what you'd do with them. The ringing in my ears wasn't warning me anymore. It was mourning, a funeral dirge for the person I'd been who'd thought loyalty and precision and doing the right thing would be rewarded with recognition and safety. That person had been murdered with bureaucratic efficiency, filed away under false charges, and replaced with something sharper, something harder, something that could look at a temple full of heretics and see only numbers, angles, optimal destruction vectors. I'd become a weapon, and the weapon had been carefully forged in the blast furnaces of the Penal Legions, hammered into shape by missions designed to test and strengthen and refine until nothing remained of the original material except the useful bits. How many others? I asked, because I was still a clerk at heart, still needed to know the full accounting. How many Penal Legionnaires are actually just experiments, transformations in progress? 30% of our intake, the colonel said without hesitation. Carefully selected individuals with skills or traits we need, but who can't be openly trained in the roles we require. The Imperium runs on systems, Rekka 7, and one of those systems is the conversion of loyal servants into necessary monsters. You think the Inquisition recruits interrogators from volunteers? You think the Officio Assassinorum trains its operatives in sanctioned academies? Power comes from breaking people in specific ways and catching the pieces that fall in the right configuration. You were broken very carefully, very precisely, and every mission was another impact designed to crack away the unnecessary until only the essential remained. I looked at the black uniform in the box, at the rank insignia that represented authority I'd never wanted, and understood finally what I'd been counting toward all along. Not death, not redemption, completion. The finishing of a process that had started the moment I'd filed those reports, that had continued through my conviction and penal service, and 17 missions that had each taken pieces of who I'd been and replaced them with who I was needed to become. The ringing in my ears would never stop, because it wasn't damage, it was enhancement. My nervous system rewired by repeated blast trauma into something that could sense danger through pressure waves and frequency shifts, turning my body into a living sensor array for the very explosives I deployed. The shrapnel in my chest wasn't medical waste worth extracting. It was a permanent reminder of the cost of transformation, metal in my flesh like the metal in my soul. What happens now? I asked, though I already knew the answer, could hear it in the layered frequencies of the ringing, in the harmonic resonance of inevitability. The colonel closed the black box, sealing the uniform away again. Now you choose, he said simply. You can take this commission, join a regular regiment, live something approximating a normal guard life with your new skills officially recognized and rewarded, or, he pulled a different set of orders from his desk, these sealed in blood-red wax, with marks I recognized from Penal Legion documentation. You can stay. Continue running missions that require someone who thinks like a clerk, but destroys like a daemon, who can calculate casualties with the same precision they once calculated tithe discrepancies. The Penal Legions always need people who've survived long enough to teach the others. to guide them through their own transformations. I thought about Wrecker 9, barely 18 years old and missing a foot to acid, still counting her way toward whatever ending awaited her. I thought about the new wreckers who cycled through our unit, terrified and broken, and clinging to the hope that punishment would eventually end in forgiveness. I thought about the black boxes they all carried, sealed with secrets about their own transformations, about the purposes the Imperium had for them that they couldn't yet see. I'd counted 17 missions, thinking I was tallying survival against impossible odds. But I'd been counting something else entirely: proof of concept, demonstration of the method's effectiveness, evidence that the system worked and could be replicated with others. I was the model for transformation, and transformation is only valuable if it can be taught. "I'll stay," I said, and the ringing in my ears shifted to something almost peaceful, a steady tone that felt like confirmation, like arrival. "But I want access to the real records. I want to know which ones are experiments and which ones are actual criminals, so I can guide them properly." The colonel smiled then, genuinely smiled, and it transformed his face from something hard and unyielding into something almost human. "You won't be able to tell the difference," he said. "That's the beauty of the system. By the time they reach you, their crimes and their purposes have merged into the same thing. They're all guilty of being useful, and they're all being punished with transformation, and which one came first stops mattering after the first few missions." He handed me the blood-sealed orders, and I felt their weight like I'd once felt the weight of archived reports, documents that contained truth too dangerous to speak aloud, but too important to ignore. I took the new Wrecker 4 under my supervision the next day, reading his file with eyes that saw past the listed crimes to the skills the Imperium needed him to develop. Former Medicae orderly, convicted of stealing painkillers that, according to classified notes I now had clearance to read, had been deliberately placed in his path to see if he'd demonstrate the kind of desperate compassion that made good combat medics when broken and rebuilt properly. I started teaching him demolitions the way the colonel had taught me. Through precision, through calculated risk, through missions that would test him in exactly the ways necessary to crack away who he'd been and reveal who he needed to become. The ringing in my ears helped me measure his progress, picking up the subtle frequencies of fear and adaptation, and slow, horrified understanding as he realized what was being done to him. On my 20th mission, no longer counting backward, now counting forward in a different context, I placed charges on a traitor guard artillery position that had been shelling Imperial lines for 3 weeks. The ringing guided my hands, showed me the exact points where the structure would fail most catastrophically, taught me through years of enforced learning how to make destruction look like art. Wrecker 4 watched me work with eyes that held the same desperate hope I'd once carried, the belief that if he just survived long enough, was precise enough, loyal enough, he'd be rewarded with a return to normalcy. I didn't tell him that normalcy was already dead, killed the moment his file had been flagged for conversion. He'd learn the truth the same way I had, slowly, painfully, through accumulated revelations that built like pressure behind a blast wall. The charges detonated in sequence, each explosion feeding into the next, creating a cascading failure that collapsed the entire artillery position into its own ammunition stores. The secondary detonations lit the night sky like falling stars, beautiful in their devastation, perfect in their mathematics. I watched from our extraction point and felt nothing except the satisfaction of a job executed correctly, numbers adding up to their intended total, outcomes matching predictions within acceptable margins of error. This was what I'd become, someone who could witness mass death and calculate it like inventory, who could transform human beings into components of explosive yield, who had been broken so thoroughly that my only remaining wholeness came from the precision of my work. The colonel found me later, standing on the command deck of our transport watching the fires still burning at the artillery position. "You're teaching them well," he said, not specifying whether he meant demolitions technique or the deeper lesson about transformation. "The success rate has improved since you took over training." I touched my chest, felt the shrapnel shift, listened to the ringing that never stopped, that I'd learned to pass into meaning and purpose. "I'm teaching them to count," I said. "Same as I learned. They just don't know what they're really counting yet." "Will you tell them?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. I considered the question, thought about Rekka 9 and Rekka 4 and all the others who'd come after, carrying their black boxes full of secrets about purposes they couldn't comprehend. "No," I decided finally. "The counting only works if you think it's measuring your survival. If you know from the start that you're being refined instead of punished, you'll try to resist the transformation, try to hold on to who you were. But if you think you're dying, if you believe each mission is punishment bringing you closer to execution, then you'll change without realizing it. You'll become what's needed because you'll think you're just trying to survive long enough to earn redemption." The colonel nodded as if I'd passed some final test, confirmed something he'd suspected but needed to hear proven. "The Imperium is built on systems," he said again, a phrase I'd heard from him countless times, but now I understood its full meaning. Systems that seem cruel are sometimes the kindest way to create what's necessary. Better to think you're being punished than to know you're being transformed, because punishment at least preserves the hope of eventual freedom, while transformation demands you accept that the person you were is never coming back. I counted 23 missions before the war in our sector ended, and our unit was redeployed to a new theater. 23 different destructions, 23 sets of calculations that turned structures into rubble and lives into acceptable losses. I trained 17 new wreckers in that time, watched some of them die and others survive long enough to start hearing the ringing in their own ears, developing their own damaged senses into new forms of perception. I opened black boxes with them when they'd earned the revelation, showed them their files and their purposes, guided them through the same slow horror of understanding I'd experienced. Some broke differently than expected, couldn't be salvaged for the roles the Imperium had planned. Others exceeded predictions, transformed into specialists even more effective than their designers had hoped. The ringing in my ears developed new frequencies with each passing year, my nervous system adapting further, finding new ways to pass explosive force into useful information. I could stand at the edge of a blast crater and read its story like I'd once read shipping manifests, understanding the type of charge used, the yield employed, the intention behind the placement. I became a living archive of destruction, cataloging methods and outcomes with the same precision I'd brought to my old clerical work. The Imperium had taken a clerk and made a weapon, but the weapon retained the clerk's obsessive need for organization, for proper documentation, for making sure every number added up correctly. On my 50th mission, a significant number, round and complete, though I no longer knew if I was counting toward anything or simply maintaining a record, I received new orders sealed with the Departamento Militarum's highest classification marks. Transfer to a specialist training facility, assignment as primary instructor for advanced demolitions techniques, rank elevation to full officer status. The transformation was complete. I was no longer being refined. I was the refining process itself. The system made flesh, the method proven effective enough to be franchised across the Imperium's countless war zones. They'd broken me with such precision that I'd become the template for breaking others, the proof of concept that would justify breaking thousands more. I stood in the colonel's office one final time before my transfer, the space familiar now in a way my old archive workspace had never been, and he finally told me his own story, how he'd been an accountant in the Administratum 50 years ago, caught in a manufactured scandal about missing war material, sentenced to the Penal Legions, where someone had recognized that a man who could track inventory could also track human behavior, predict breaking points, design transformation protocols with actuarial precision. He'd survived 30 missions before they'd offered him the choice I'd been given: commission into a regular regiment, or remain and guide others through the same process. He'd stayed, obviously, had been staying for 5 decades, refining the system with each new generation of Penal Legionnaires, learning which types of breaking produced which types of specialists. "You'll do better than I did," he said, and his voice carried the weight of years spent watching people transform, counting successes and failures with the same obsessive precision I'd learned from him. You understand the mathematics at a deeper level, can hear the frequencies in ways I never learned. The next generation of specialists you train will be more effective than any we've produced before. He handed me a new black box, larger than the others, heavy with contents I couldn't yet imagine. Everything you need to know about the program is in here. The full statistics, the success rates, the methods for identifying candidates and designing their breaking processes. You're not just teaching demolitions anymore. You're teaching transformation itself. I left the Penal Legions with a chest full of shrapnel, ears that rang with permanent frequencies, and knowledge that made me complicit in a system I'd once believed was punishment, but now understood was creation. The Imperium doesn't waste anything, not even its criminals, not even its clerks. It takes what's broken and breaks it further in specific directions until the pieces fall into useful configurations, then calls those pieces soldiers, specialists, servants of the Emperor's will. I'd been broken so completely that I'd become the breaking, transformed so thoroughly that I was now the transformation, counted so obsessively that I'd become the count itself. The ringing in my ears never stopped, even in the silence of my new quarters at the training facility. Even when there were no explosions for kilometers in any direction, it had become the sound of my existence, the frequency at which I vibrated, the tone that defined who I'd been made into. Sometimes, in moments between training sessions, I would think about that clerk in the archives who'd believed doing the right thing would be rewarded with recognition and safety. That person seemed impossibly naive now, impossibly fragile. Someone who'd existed in a universe where systems served justice instead of purpose, where loyalty meant protection instead of selection for transformation. I trained my first class of demolitions specialists 3 months after my transfer, and none of them had red sashes or Penal Legion designations. They were regular guard, volunteers who'd shown aptitude for explosive work and wanted to develop their skills further. I taught them the mathematics of destruction with the same precision I'd learned, showed them how to read structures for weakness, how to calculate yield and blast radius, and optimal charge placement. But I also watched for the ones who showed more than simple aptitude, who demonstrated that particular combination of loyalty, precision, and adaptability that marked them as suitable for deeper transformation. Their names went into reports that would be filed in archives I'd once worked in, processed by clerks who'd never know they were selecting candidates for conversion, people who'd eventually commit crimes that might be real or might be manufactured, but would definitely be useful. The system perpetuates itself because the system understands what the Imperium truly needs. Not heroes, not volunteers, not willing servants, but people broken in such specific ways that their fragments can be assembled into weapons of perfect obedience and terrible effectiveness. I'd become one of those weapons, and now I was forging others, teaching them to count themselves toward transformations they couldn't yet perceive, guiding them through breaking processes they'd mistake for punishment or training or simple bad luck. The ringing in my ears taught me one final frequency after my first year as an instructor, a note so deep I felt it more than heard it, resonating through the shrapnel in my chest and the bones of my skull. This is what it means to serve the Imperium, not as you wish to serve it, but as it needs you to serve. Not as the person you were, but as the thing you've become, counting forever forward into transformations that never end, because the Imperium's need for broken and rebuilt servants is as infinite as the galaxy itself. I'd thought I was counting missions, counting survival, counting towards some final number that would mark the end of my suffering and the beginning of my redemption. But I'd been counting something else entirely, proof that the system worked, that loyalty could be weaponized through carefully applied trauma, that the best servants of mankind were made not born, forged in blast furnaces of deliberate breaking, until nothing remained except the useful pieces. I still count, even now, even years after my last combat deployment, even in the relative safety of the training facility where I shape new specialists from raw material that doesn't yet know it's being shaped. I count the students who show potential for deeper transformation. I count the reports I file identifying candidates for conversion. I count the missions they'll eventually run, the breaking they'll eventually endure, the revelations they'll eventually face when their own black boxes open and show them what they've become. The count never ends, because the need never ends, and I am the system now, the method made manifest, the proof that transformation works if applied with sufficient precision and patience. The Emperor protects, the preachers say, and perhaps he does, but protection takes forms we'd never choose for ourselves if we understood what we were asking for. The Imperium protects its people by breaking some of them into tools for protecting the rest, by identifying those capable of surviving transformation and subjecting them to processes that destroy who they were to create who they must be. I was protected by being made into a weapon. I protect others by making them into weapons too. The count continues, the ringing never stops, and somewhere in the archives, a clerk who doesn't know they're already selected for transformation is about to file a report that will change their life forever, thinking they're being loyal, not understanding that loyalty is exactly what marks them for breaking. This is the brutal life of a Penal Legion explosives specialist. Not the missions, not the danger, not the suffering or the death, but the slow realization that you were never being punished at all, that every moment of pain was purposeful, that the Imperium doesn't waste anything, especially not the pieces of people broken in exactly the right ways to become the tools it desperately needs. I count, because counting gives meaning to transformation, because numbers don't lie, even when everything else does, because somewhere in the mathematics of my missions and my training and my endless refinement of the system, I can find proof that my breaking served a purpose, that my transformation produced something useful, that the clerk who reported those false manifests died in service to something larger than individual justice or personal redemption. The ringing in my ears is the sound of that purpose, a frequency that will never fade because the Imperium's need will never end, and I have become the need made flesh, the system embodied, counting forward forever into transformations that create more counters who'll count their own transformations, each number adding to the great tally of humanity's survival, purchased with the precise and calculated breaking of anyone loyal enough, precise enough, adaptable enough to be worth destroying and rebuilding in the Emperor's service. I am Wrecker 7. I am the Count. I am the transformation, and I have finally stopped counting backward from death and learned to count forward into the infinite necessity of the Imperium's hunger for broken servants who can be made whole in new and terrible ways, one mission at a time, one revelation at a time, one transformed soul at a time, forever.